Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. This is something of an experiment, which I discussed with our learned colleague here. It's the first time we've tried this. So what we learn from this year, we will refine in future years. I hope that it's an interesting set, well, I'm sure it will be an interesting set of presentations, but we rely on you for participation. So after the three presentations, I will be passing the microphone around for questions to our audience to participate. And I think we will also be able to take some questions from Design and Make who are online. The title is Discourse on Methods, which I have borrowed and slightly updated from Descartes. It also prompted me to reread Descartes, and I was surprised at the convergence of the things he considered important in research and thinking about the relationship of method to our intellectual inquiries. We all share quite a number of techniques, but I think more significantly we share a concern that architecture should be for the betterment of society, and increasingly these days to question and improve the relations of architecture to the natural world. There are various chains of logic that we use to rationalize our designs, but intuition, ambition are crucial to determining what methods we choose to use. And the questions that I'll be asking today are very much in line with the questions that Descartes asked of himself and of society in his day. Does method constrain what we can think about? Does it provide already a limitation of what can be thought? We're concerned also with the exegesis of an expository design. That is, as architects, we design something in order to demonstrate the logic and the rationale for the work we have carried out as research. And finally, we're concerned with what counts as original knowledge. We tend to think that everything we design is some kind of research, but that isn't always so, unless we deliberately set it out to be. And I do think, in my own view, there's a continual personal struggle for architects with the desire to be an author, to do something that's different to everyone else, that's uniquely yours, and how that impacts on society. Yes. So I'm going to pass now over to the first of our presentations, to the DRL.
Okay. All right, thanks, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. I have the privilege to be speaking to you guys today with Nerma for what we hope to be a conversational event. My name is Theodore Spiropoulos. I direct the program. And we thought, in terms of sharing some of the conversation today, it's more about stating a kind of motivation about why we do what we do and how we go about that. So method and practice is something that's very much embedded in the way that we see this kind of collective experiment of the Design Research Lab. I start with a kind of McLuhanism. If you're interested in the future, look to the present as we live in the past. I think architecture is no different than other kinds of paradoxically human things, where we're creatures of habit, and in some sense we need to challenge the orthodoxies of our ways if we're trying to really be responsive to our time. Design research is a big part of the conversation in some sense within the DRL, but design research is also a design search. It's about asking questions and trying to allow those questions to be informed by meaningful ways of experimenting. The motivation around all of the work, as I mentioned in method and practice, as the DRL is a shared and a collective environment, is to construct a framework to enable people and to construct a shared vision. that vision has a home in this place, regardless if it was designed by individuals or groups, teachers with students. It's really about sort of seeing things as something conversational and something that's an evolving experiment. So within the studio setting, within all of the limits and the constraints, not being somehow tied to those kind of aspects of what design should be, but what it can be, and to see this kind of collective and shared values emerge through problems. The history of the DRL has been quite long. It's been over 2 decades. The ideas of making plays a very fundamental role in sort of constructing kind of ways to somehow challenge the things that we're doing. So side projects, developing kinds of things. It's all in the spirit of, let's say, what Hans Hollein would say, everything is architecture, all are architects. And in this provocation and the magazine Bow, it was really a kind of search space, which was a calling and a provocation to all architects that a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of traditional building will enter into architecture, and architects will have to enter into other domains. And I think this is at the heart of, let's say, the 17 years that I've been directing this program. The challenges at that time was also to take stake in the role of computation. You'll see here early parametric drawings, computational arts, exhibitions like cybernetic serendipity that really didn't create kind of meaningful distinctions between disciplines. At the same time, life in a computerized environment, things like the Architecture Machine Group, which was a space for research, evolved into the Media Lab and was part of that kind of communication revolution. Different kinds of educational experiments between art and technology. I think all of these things play a very important role, so does the way that we choose to engage in these things. And I think at the heart of that, things like Black Mountain College is an interesting model for me, and Victor Papernik's kind of calling and seminal book, Design for the Real World, I think is something that's also very important. This is part of a continuing experiment, and part of that is understanding the role that what we are developing today somehow engages in conversations that have been in this home and in many other homes. Play and togetherness, I think, is a way that we somehow work together on problems. In the program, we work collectively, but what we condition as a form of research actually happens through 3 or 4 year kind of research experiments. That takes many forms, and that utilizes kind of all aspects, kind of building on the tradition that using the AA as an experiment itself. The ideas of design research are based primarily on the kind of thoughts of laboratory life and the structure of scientific revolution, and Thomas Kuhn very aptly said the answers you get depends on the questions that you ask. And I think that that's a very kind of important way of thinking about how design research and methodology plays a role in this. And being kind of open to kind of question technologies, not to foreground them. Adam Curtis made a strong kind of commentary on that with his films. But it's also about humanizing technology, and once technologies are out of the box, you can't basically put them back in. So what we do with them, the culture that evolves around them, if it's through gamification, and understanding that things themselves have their own agency and their own way of basically acting in the world, and to try to kind of give agency to our students to actively participate by allowing them really and affording them the luxury that any kind of question is a meaningful question, and if it's spatial, it's architectural. Challenging models, I think, is very important, and problems. So looking at things like AutoStore and Amazon Warehouse as an organizational model could be a way of thinking about post-disaster scenarios. Thinking that things themselves actively act in the world. Here's Raffaello Di Andrea's robotic chair, where the chair itself knows its degree of chairness. And so in a sense, a search space is not kind of relegated just to a kind of human agent or a non-human agent. It's really about understanding that things in the world and what intelligence could mean is something that's in between things and not something that's basically attributed to something in itself. Within the program, I think we continuously try to really have a digital physical analog, trying to develop kind of strategies that both can kind of engage and problematize. At the heart of it is basically speaking that the world is latent and unknown, And to be able to sort of contribute an architectural kind of response to things, we have to somehow challenge the kind of orthodoxies of thinking that building by itself is a meaningful answer. Trying to look at experiments and experimentation using the different tool sets as a form of methodology to instrumentalize and to somehow conceptualize different ways of constructing goal-oriented ways of thinking about things. This isn't a column, it's a goal of going vertical with a certain population of agents. Cedric Price in this room basically said technology is the answer, and he basically followed that up with what was a question. The things that we're sort of exploring today is moving towards what I'm calling an elemental architecture, which is trying to understand the environment and its role. If there is an AI, it's an architectural intelligence which deals with the paradoxes, not the biases of database systems and so forth. And it's really a return to all of the constituencies that support life, which we think is a very fundamental aspect of what architecture is, urbanism, infrastructure. So a lot of the things, in some sense, are really trying to negotiate those complexities and try to build an understanding in the ways that we sort of work on the problems. Analog experiments, digital simulations, ways of understanding the environment and interpreting it, all of that are in the service of actually trying to work on complex problems and to try to do that in a meaningful way. The world is not short of problems, so I think the everyday is a really radical project today. But trying to understand how we can reconceptualize these things, I think, is very important. And trying to look at things like desertification, different kinds of ecological problems, and starting to look at it as where phenomenon could also be considered as technology is important. And this lends itself to students actually doing sometimes unorthodox examples like welding sand and things like that in really the service of trying to really address kind of challenges that really start to move and connect into larger discourses, things that Frei Otto and others were looking at, and Buckminster Fuller, Eladio Dieste, about trying to work with the world and trying to see that as a medium for basically human engagement. And these are some of the experiments that have been happening recently, and that was presented in this room in March. I think the important kind of aspect of all of these things is really to construct agency and facilitate new forms of communication. Even attempts to sort of make the world more, let's call it autonomous, like these robot developments, start to kind of tease out very human conditions of how our students that may be designing mobility agent can actually evolve a much more engaged and emotive response to these things. So as we sort of work on some of these problems and take the computer out into the world and immerse ourselves within that, we try to find ways of sort of setting up this space as a kind of experiment in itself, and to try to think about how we interface. This is an example of just basically using brain sensing and scanning as a way to develop a different form of learning. How do we interface with things that are tangible media in the world? How do we communicate using more intuitive ways instead of kind of devices that in some sense render us behind the screen? And in the service to make this much more conversational, to engage with these kind of living particles in the world. So here Didem is communicating and basically expressing her kind of positions in a way so that this kind of living particle, a lifelike particle, not living anyway, can somehow engage in a meaningful kind of proof of concept of some of these things. I leave with one question, which is more of a provocation. In 2 days, tomorrow will be yesterday, and I think in some ways everything that we are discussing today can be tomorrow's past. So the issue is where is the continuation and where is the evolution of ideas? And I think, at least with the students, with the staff of the DRL and so forth, these are the kinds of questions that we ask on a daily basis. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Theo. We'll return to questions after the next two presentations. Thank you very much. So if I can ask the Design and Make team.
Hi guys, I'm Kate Davies. I co-direct Design and Make together with Emmanuel Vacruza, who's over there having his lunch at Hook Park. So it's nice that we're watching most of Design and Make students having their lunch together, which is appropriate, I think, in terms of the way that Design and Make operate as a collective, very intentionally as a collective. And in that vein, I'm going to hand over to our students to frame some questions and some of the methods and agendas of Design and Make.
Yes. We wanted to not make a Design and Make presentation. This time we divided our method or methodology into 3 main streams. Okay, these 3 streams of thoughts are deeply rooted in our work. What's more, they together shape the way that we conceive architecture. So I'm going to start talking about the collective model this greatly marks our understanding of architectural as production. I'm just going to go through the images there. For us, the creation of a building emerged from a process of collective design. We are part of a multidisciplinary group, which we come from different backgrounds. This group of people that live together in Hook Park, we interact every day. This group of people contribute through dialogue, constant dialogue, daily dialogue, by sharing ideas and experiences. This group of people get together into designing and prototyping and testing these ideas also on a daily basis. So the main idea that we want to share in between this mainstream is that we work together, we engage every day, every aspect of the process that we are aiming to get. No? Regarding our background, no? That's how we create cumulative knowledge. In our process of thinking and producing and designing, anyone can influence the design, the engineering, the testing, the planning, and they all get nurtured by each other. No? I think the objective of what I'm trying to say now is we have one objective, that is to end this association between design or designer and actually making in architecture. No?
So I'm going to talk about material engagement. That's one of the, I think, fundamentals that is a part of the collective, and I think that there is a sort of affectation of the sort of poetic discourse that's created by just being in the forest and experiencing that space. When we first arrived, there was this sense of how do we share this amazing space with everybody, and as I think we go through, it becomes a matter of how do we protect these resources. And when it comes down to resources, you really get a holistic approach, and there's an incredibly humanistic affect to that. When you begin designing, when you begin making, there's not just a question of what can we make, what is possible, what's the future hold, what does the past hold, it's what's here, right? There is an incredibly present moment. So when you begin designing, you're looking at, there's a forest, there's a decimated forest coverage within the UK, and that lends to a sense of resource limitation. Coming from a place that has like 54% forest coverage to a place that has 13%. Looking at how to engage with those resources, I think, is incredibly important. How do we use these maybe trees with poor genetics that have bifurcated, created forks, and how do we use that instead of looking at it as a weakness, look at it as a strength? How do we engage with the natural movement, natural geometries of those trees? So beyond just the hand, the craft that is used in the process of making, and beyond the design, there's also the question of what are we asking the world to do every time we design a building or design a structure. We're asking for logistics, specifically on this island. We're asking for other countries to cut down trees, put themselves in danger to give us those trees, send them across an ocean, risk the loss of those resources, exchange currency across economies. We're looking for industries within to parse out those resources. And I think that becomes really profound in the way that we engage with the methods of production and not just the methods of design, and we try to find some relationship between them. So looking at the use of the robot, use of CNC tools to solve problems that are pragmatic and practical, ones that are right in front of us. Trying to create center lines through these materials to figure out how to activate the most from those resources. And through the collective, I think there's this humanistic example of each person coming from a specific culture, having a different relationship with material, whether you can only lift a small branch or whether you can lift large objects, you can add to the conversation, to speak to what Miguel was saying about the collective and this sort of dissemination of leadership, where the collective is an aggregate of members rather than a commune speaking to a leader, in which case we have two directors where you already sort of bifurcate that leadership and where their role becomes more of a instigator of curiosity rather than a representative of an entire knowledge base. And they sort of relinquish that authority, which I think is really impactful to sort of precedents that were set within the architectural community previously.
I will just touch on the research through practice. We're very fortunate to be located in Hook Park, where we have the buildings standing. They've been completed and built by our predecessors, which we inhabit on a daily basis. We can use this to find out what has worked and what hasn't worked, and to influence our design as a collective moving forwards. Along with the existing buildings, we have the increase in archive, which is creating a vernacular style, stylistic language associated to Hook Park. Through production and testing of our elements at one-to-one in the real world, it reveals their weaknesses or oversights in simulation modeling. These iterations of design are then developed by the collective model, with anyone providing feedback on any of these elements. It creates a positive feedback loop on the design that is influenced by anyone within the group acting in any of the capacities as engineer or fabricator or designer. Whilst we are creating these one-to-one pieces, design is often dictated by the limitations of our production techniques. For example, the angles achievable by the bandsaw on the robot, or the depth of the mill bit or saw blade that we have. This direct engagement on site evolves the designer of the collective and the makers involved within it into one, creating something that is greater than the sum of our parts.
I think that the idea is to narrow the gap between the architectural proposal and the materialization of our ideas. No? The goal is to create a technological synergy with the craftsmanship and the material understanding, not to be dependent on technology while denying other aspects of daily real life or daily human problems. We try to be more responsible and more honest with that, acknowledging architecture as a service, addressing real problems.
Thank you. And now emergent technologies in design.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Elif Erdine, Director of MTech, and I'm joined by Milad Shokatsbach, and we will be talking about, if I can start, All right. MTech. So I guess what I would like to start with first, are you running it?
I'm not running. Yes.
Is there timing?
Yeah.
Can you stop the timer? Yeah, mouse click. Okay. Okay, we start again. So what we would like to start with today is how in emergent technologies and design we're addressing emerging problems, and that really requires us to question the role of the architect. So the solutions that we come up with obviously might be architectural, they might be ecological, they might be urban solutions, material systems, and obviously various design methodologies, as well as computational workflows, as well as software applications. In MTech, it has all been about experimentation throughout the past 2 decades. We have a culture of making, as you might know, and just to reiterate the words of Herbert Simon, author of The Sciences of the Artificial, which will sound familiar to you, it's really about iterative computational processes that proceed to analyses and propositions, simulations, and that is serial. So there's an ongoing cycle between those things, basically the act of form finding, analysis, simulations, so on and so forth. And as we go throughout the course, we obviously advance the techniques that we use, and these also are then kind of geared towards various advanced fabrication as well as robotic fabrication techniques. The way we start looking into or exploring research methods, we just divided it into kind of 3, let's say, domains, but of course these domains are quite integrated. So we first start with testing various physical systems, material systems. And these tests really take place through understanding the limits of material systems and how we can then translate what we learn from materials into computational processes. And as I said earlier, this is an ongoing feedback loop. And these are then translated into fabrication systems, and later on, during the seminar courses, we move on to more kind of complex fabrication methodologies that involve multiple material systems and resolving their intricate details and so on and so forth, as well as dealing or exploring various robotic fabrication systems for different material systems. And you're seeing some of the examples that we explore not only in MTech, but also throughout the visiting schools that we run in Istanbul and in London. We really love building in MTech. I could describe that as a joy of making. And of course, the AA, particular Bedford Square, has been a research platform in this sense for the past 2 decades. We believe in learning by doing, and we like to work with this, what we could call the atelier tradition. So from each and every project that we build, we learn a specific method, or we work with one specific method, basically. And these structures, throughout the years, they have had different functionalities, different scales, and in each of them, we explored a kind of particular making and fabrication technique, and of course, the computational processes that are involved with it. Some of them are results of collaboration, such as MTech and ETH. Some of them are master's thesis dissertations, we're seeing here. And we really believe in the importance of collaboration with the industry, because we believe that obviously that will lead to new knowledge. And so one recent example that you might be familiar with, I'm just going to summarize it, was this collaboration we held with Hassel Studio around a year and a half ago, where it was very interesting because we were approached to work with recycled materials. So it was a new kind of research domain for us, where we were able to employ our computational and simulation techniques to really understand the properties of this material and to build a structure that could be load-bearing. And of course, it's not about producing an end result. What is really important is analyzing that end result, because for us, it's also about disseminating the knowledge through publications, which we will touch on a couple of slides later.
What complements this physical exploration in MTech, which we kick off the course with, is the digital realm, which will be acted as a medium for us to extend what is limited in the physical world. And what we really highlight and put emphasis on is nature as a computing machine. We use it as a lesson, as a platform to learn from. Something like I think it was Christopher Alexander said that the scientist is there out to understand the current existing structure in nature, but us designers are trying to come up with the components of a system that never exists, and that's when we start to learn and understand the principles back from nature as a learning platform. And these processes are not only metaphorical and morphological, as it was reflected in the revised version of the book by Philip Stedman, Evolution of Designs, where the form follows nature's process, and we are looking into nature as a repository of systems and processes that are available for us to learn, to dissect from micro to macro level. Not only the systems that are tangible for us, also deep down in the genetics of the natural systems. And these are creating a very intricate and positive feedback loop between our discipline and other disciplines, where we are very interested in biology. And through this back and forth and the seminars that we run in MTech, we explore how to abstract these principles and apply them into our own discipline. These are the examples of different seminars and projects that our students are equipped with skills and knowledge of how to understand and learn and study natural systems, abstract them to the level of functional abstraction, and then apply them into the natural and architectural systems. What we do in MTech is understanding that whatever we do as humans is not artificial, it's part of our nature, and we have to respect that notion of whatever human does is nature, as Alan Watts says. And in order to follow that, we believe that the architect's role is going to be shifted, rather than coming up with a single design solution for a problem at hand, rather than coming up with a way of asking the question and reformulating the question that we are asking as architects in order to be well suited within the context that we are operating in. And these two components, physical and digital, then will be complemented to one another as a yin-yang to become like a hybrid model as a thesis comes to the FA.
And at that point, that really takes us to the kind of the multiscaler design approach that we employ in MTech, where we address emerging problems across different scales. As I said, emergent technologies for emerging design problems, addressing multiscaler design through novel architecture responses, trying to come up with creative solutions to existing design problems. And so, obviously, contribution to knowledge through publications, through dissemination of knowledge is very important. And I'm just going to end this by just showing a couple of dissertations, and again, kind of reflecting back on Herbert Simon, and let's say kind of reflecting back on what he said several decades ago. So ultimately, as architects, we are devising artifacts that have certain properties and functions. And the artificial world is centered precisely on this interface between the inner and outer environments. It is concerned with attaining goals by adapting the former to the latter, as in the inner environment of the object should be adapting to the external environment. And of course, in this case, we're all aware that the external environment is constantly changing and adapting. So our proposals should have adaptability towards those changing conditions as well. We do not see buildings or cities as static objects. They're constantly dynamic, and we should be addressing and understanding the dynamics of change. Obviously, we should be well informed about the natural sciences, including mathematics, biology, urban dynamics, complex systems, so on and so forth. Our proposals should have a certain degree of mutability, that means changeability. So, as in, if we put our design proposals in different environments, they should be adaptable to those different environments. They should be able to be tested by other people, so experiments should be able to be replicated and repeated. And perhaps, as a last note, they should be human-enabled, and they should be responsive to the cultural and social context. And what I mean by that is that they can also serve as interfaces between the architect and the user. And that can take place through different ways and platforms. They can be online platforms, user-enabled or participation-enabled platforms, as well as fabrication-assisted platforms. And just to end up with this phrase that you might be well aware of, every generation must build its own city. So we're constantly trying to invent and reinvent how are we going to build our cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Elif and Milad. And that's one of my favorite slides, the one at the end. And I think it was said in 1914 by St. Elia. What I'm struck with today is, first of all, the sheer enjoyment that the programs have in inventing new ways of thinking about architecture. And what I also deeply enjoy is the inherent belief that architecture and acting as architects can help to make the world better. So to challenge that a little bit, and to give you a little perspective on that, I think in all three, but particularly if I remember in Theo's, the boundaries of what counts as architecture have profoundly changed. And I was sitting in this room in 1981, which was shockingly long time ago for some of you, and being told, well, architecture has, you know, it's a discipline of its own. And I think all three presentations were saying today it isn't, that its boundaries are across many subjects, many techniques, and many methods are included in it. So I'd like maybe to ask Maria if she'd like to ask the first question, either on any of the topics or something that occurred to you during the presentation. And when we do the questions, can you speak to the microphone so that will then be recorded and other people will be able to access it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Actually, thanks to all the presenters. It was like really, as Mike said, really amazing to see also the passion that goes really in these projects and the faith that we really have some sort of agency still. I would really have a few questions, and especially the last presentation triggered a lot of thoughts. And one question really came to my mind when Elif was talking about dissemination. I think that was a really good point to make, especially about these three programs. I would say that all the programs in school are producing research that can be of interest to the world outside of academia and outside of the AA. But I do think that we as architects, we increasingly have a problem with communicating with the wider society, media, and people who are not specialists. And I think particularly these three programs produce knowledge that I think is relevant to what goes on out there, that it is innovative, and that it should be known, and it should be disseminated, and it should have an impact, right? All the programs do that. But I guess that, of course, the time frame of historical critical research, for instance, that is the kind of thing that most PhD candidates, for instance, do, is a kind of longer duration, right? I think, on the contrary, these three programs can really have an impact, like literally tomorrow, that is the yesterday, of course, of next week. So I was wondering, actually, in the three cases, how do you find this struggle of kind of piercing the barrier of, going outside of academia to engage with people who are not specialists or who are specialists of other fields, right? Up to, for instance, politicians or local authorities and so on and so forth. Because I really think that these three programs have an amazing potential of doing it right now that maybe most other programs in school don't really have, because, again, it doesn't mean that they are not impactful, it's that their impact is maybe just slower or on a different time scale. So I was wondering about that. How do you find the question of establishing a dialogue with the world out there and really blurring this boundary, this really problematic boundary between academia and the world, and particularly I would say really politics and the industry, which you also mentioned, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I can pick up on that. I mean, we haven't talked with politicians yet. I would love to at some point. we talk obviously a lot with the industry. But I mean, I understand the question. I think it's about the level of abstraction and how we want to reach out to the people with different expertise areas. So obviously, with someone from the industry, I can talk perhaps in a more, let's say, technically advanced way. But when we want to talk to people outside the community, we need to be very careful about how we word our research. We have to be careful about how we talk about these things. And it also applies to the way we, let's say, communicate our simulations, because essentially simulations are abstractions. And so it's about the level of abstraction and what we want the wider community to engage with and how they can engage with it. So I think that as architects, we really need to think about how the community can be engaged with the research, and of course that depends on the research area as well, and really gear the conversation towards that end in a way, so that everyone can be part of that process. I don't know, do you want to add anything?
One important thing that in MTech I think is very valued is publication. Like, when I say publication, I mean journal and conferences. I think that's a very good medium to communicate with your peers outside of your own discipline and also in other schools. This is something that proven to be very helpful for both our students and our faculty to get to know what's happening out there in the world and communicate the research outcome with other schools and our institutions. And I think this is very crucial for reaching out and getting to know what's happening out there and sharing your knowledge with other people. Yeah.
I think, again, it's a very important question, and I think in DRL we engage with practice very intensely through all the tutors, or great majority of the tutors are working in practice, and they are the students are collaborating with engineers who are also actively involved with projects which do have an impact. I think also in terms of the school itself, we have students who are working in DPL and different departments. So again, it's very much part of the, as Theo described, the idea of the collective, the idea of the group work, and the idea of building up on the knowledge, not just of the current kind of teamwork or time span of 1 year, but literally building up on the particular studio direction in the DRL, but then in terms of the school at large, and building up on the founders, the Zahadid architects, and their contribution.
It's like hot potato, just passing it around. I'm gonna just make a couple of comments. I think maybe the most important and meaningful way is to enable students to feel like they have agency, to reject the fact that the answer is outside. and to really actively participate in things that they think they can challenge. The building industry is probably the most obsolete industry, so I have no feelings or emotional connection to think that they have a solution. And I don't think architecture is an academic exercise, and so part of that is also not to believe that the things that happen here should just be kind of packaged. But I do think that students should also be much more kind of enabled and instrumentalized to create their own spaces out there. More entrepreneurial in terms of thinking about how they can engage what they think practice is. And I think they should feel that there's a community to support them. If I have some challenges to the school, I would say that seeing some of the things that happen here and finding a mechanism to platform and to communicate that should be part of its objective. I think that that should probably reemerge, and that's not me speaking from nostalgia, it's speaking from a statement of purpose. If the idea of the AA is to be a home for ideas, then those ideas should have agency and relevance, and the authorship of that, if it's shared and it's collective, it's not necessarily with everybody having the same belief structure, and we should be debating that, and we should do that with a certain kind of authenticity, which I think sometimes is really lacking. Because in some sense, we don't really put the work out there to speak for itself, and I think that that's the best way to actually really have a meaningful impact. But I think events like this are beginning conversations, but I'd like to think that this space has always had these discussions. I know that we are re-emerging from whatever that is, but I think the reality of the stuff is that I think architecture here should matter. And I don't think that we're here just to be critics, we're here to create. And I think those possibilities, to be honest with you, just take a lot of effort. And I think sometimes we shy away from how much effort is needed, thinking that there's easier ways. There's no easy way to this. And I also think, like, when we speak about experiments, I'm much closer to Buckminster Fuller's concept of that. His idea of an experiment was 50 years. He said that was the life's work, and his contribution was a contribution into a larger conversation, but it had a certain capacity to kind of speak beyond, let's say, a design problem or a design brief. If it was a bathroom, if it was a dome, if it was a world game, or if it was basically rethinking the map, everything could be conceptualized and worked on from that perspective. So I just think that students should be more empowered to think that they should create the spaces to kind of challenge the structures that you're mentioning.
Thank you, Thea. Before I pass on to Design and Make, I'll respond a little bit to I think that was Theo's excellent comments, and to Elif and Milad. I think in your presentation you had a quotation that tomorrow is, within a couple of days, going to be yesterday. And I want to say to the students, almost everything you think you know today, within a few years, is redundant. And that process seems to be getting more rapid. But what you will retain, and I'm with Theo, that the experiment is a lifetime. And although I'm only very slightly older than Theo, we've both been engaged for a very long time in our own particular experiment. So that what counts as knowledge is always provisional. It's fugitive. And I think the idea about creating your own space for experimentation, for the pursuit of ideas, of course you're here to get a degree and you need to do that. But mostly what you're doing is laying the foundation for what will be, one hopes, a lifetime's thinking about things you identify here that are going to sustain you for decades over your professional life. So if I could pass over for some comments from Design and Make. You're going to go first. They're all pointing at you.
No, well, to answer the question, going back to how to share the information, how to get out there, And that get me thinking that I actually don't feel like I'm surrounded by architects in Hook Park. And maybe that's a good thing. A good thing or a bad thing? A good thing. I don't feel that like I'm surrounded entirely by architects. We have different types of discussions. We are surrounded by makers, designers, engineers, foresters, etc., etc. Even, the people that we are sharing our daily life are important, no matter their role. And that makes us able to speak different languages in between the design and the making that we are doing, in between the objective that we are trying to get. No? Because now we understand about physics, we are more conscious about the humidity of the air, we are more conscious about if the sun hits a wall or not, because that directly affects our work. So I think we are in a good place because from there we're producing information. That's something that we forgot to talk about. A very important part of what we do is producing information, not only graphical, but almost more important than non-graphical information that comes with the instructions for building something. And that's something that we really care, because we are on the target to building 101 buildings each course. No? And that makes us realize that the balance is not purely design and then somebody else is going to do it. We need to make the decisions. We need to draw the set of rules and constraints that allow us in the future 2 months to build something that is going to stand up. No?
Yeah. I would agree completely with this, and just echo the point that at Hook Park, I would say we don't see ourselves as a set of architects, more as a collective of designers with varying degrees of past experience, which we can all draw on from one another, and it just so happens that we end up building a building at the end of it. Certainly not with one star architect leading a team and his views or her views solely. It is very much more this holistic group dynamic where we can all feed from one another and our past experiences and knowledge bases.
Yeah, I think the question of how do we reach the world through our work is, I think it's important. You know, there's a lot of lofty ideas about what the future is, when it is, where it is, and there's ideas about every generation needing to build its own city. I remember there was like a field trip when I was a kid, and the teacher said that they messed up the environment in their generation, they'd done all this damage, and that it was our job to inherit the earth and take care of it. And someone gave us the earth, and we're trying to reach out to the world with architecture, and we're trying to address these global issues. And I think at Hook, there's this interesting aspect that is, there is diversity of background, of culture, of profession, of specialty. There's accessibility. We can engage with the local population. I walk down the road to go farm to pick up my eggs. You know, there's direct engagement. How do we reach out to the world, I think, is more about how we build upon the relationships that we have in the space. Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with that idea of collective, of appreciating everybody's perspective, not looking at an area and seeing how we can morph it and change it and how it's going to mutate in the future, but having a humanistic approach and addressing the humans that are there and their needs, whether they have access to water, whether they have resources to build, are they going to be able to house their children, are those things going to fall down? And those, I think, are the issues that we're engaging with at Hook. We're building a structure, someone has to live in it. We know what we need. We know what it's like to be cold. We know if the boiler goes down. You know, we're I think Kate said early on, is embrace the beauty of inconvenience, or the gift of inconvenience. And I think it's not her quote. Sorry, but I appreciated that, and I think what we're supposed to do is engage with the context and acknowledge the constraints of that locale, of that region, and then expound upon them, fix them, find solutions. And that's what we're doing through the motif of architecture, but as a collective. And so that's how we're engaging with the world, I think.
I suppose very briefly, I suppose we're talking about getting out of the walls of this building, right? It's on, yeah. Then we need vectors. We put in our text that the ideas generated through the things that we make are contagious, and I think that contagion is really important. Ideas are really contagious, but you have to let them be contagious and find vectors for them to be contagious, and allow, you know, as Theo touched upon, students to find the paths outside of this building to take the research that's been done here forward, but also to infect others with those ideas. I mean, we were very lucky because it's field of dreams for us down there. If we build it, they will come, right? People have very direct engagement with the work that we stand inside it. So in that way, we can directly kind of engage people in ideas. They're very excited to stand within the buildings, and it's very, and the ideas are transmitted through objects directly without words often. I'm going to shut up now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass in a minute to Mike Ayling, who has another question for us. Just a couple of comments on that. Did you know there are more trees in London than there are people? London is classified as a kind of a forest, so apart from the extraordinariness of that fact, the things that you do there and that you do in the DRL, in the labs, and that we do, have a wider impact, and sometimes it's quite difficult for us to see that. I think also that the paradigm of nature is profoundly changing, what's considered to be natural. And I just remind you all, I think it was Elif who said that humans and their actions are part of nature, which was Francis Bacon. But I just remind you all, strontium-90 is also a part of nature. You know, nature isn't benign and beautiful and just the things that we can hug and enjoy. And we have to, each of us, build our knowledge of what is in the physical world as well as in the social world. So I'm going to pass for one more question and one more round, and then that will be it for today.
Thank you, Mike. It's more an observational set of observations about commonalities, but it may turn into a question as I go. I was interested to see that every party talked about their approach coming to the world as though it was a set of problems to engage with, and I thought that was interesting. As though, if one were to use research term, it's kind of action methodology. And I thought that was really interesting, that the sense that there is a problem out there and we don't quite know what it is. I think that's the wonderful thing about architectural research. But we know we are in a position to somehow solve, or at least begin to attempt to solve that problem. And that was picked up on by Mike and the MTech team there, and also by the adage by Price that we know what the answer is, we don't quite know what the question is. And I thought that was interesting in relation to someone like Paul Ferreira-Band, who talks about it being against method, that the history of the sciences isn't a clean-cut series of sequential methods. It was a mishmash, and problems were solved for one set of circumstances that ended up getting used for another. I think that's a fantastic thing that we can work with in the school, that these problems we're solving are collective, but we're not quite sure maybe what they are yet. So I thought that was an interesting series of common tropes. The other thing that seemed to ring true, and is fairly obvious, is the participatory nature of the methodologies across, again, all three. And I was curious to, and maybe this is where it starts to become a question, is there's a huge emphasis on collective work, on participatory models working across human and non-human sets of agencies and actors and onwards. And I'm curious to know how those set of values, perhaps, in the way that the different programs work, maybe then affect the value system of the output of the architectural propositions and proposals. And that's something that Elif picked up on in your last point, that actually the outcomes are participatory. It's not simply the method to get to the outcomes. And that the value system of working through these things is embedded in the thing that then goes out into the world, that is this final piece of architectural proposition in some way. I was curious to know whether maybe that's where the social and other impacts are in the value systems that come through the method that then come out in the final piece.
Okay, I'm going to unpick that a little bit, if you'll indulge me, and then pass to each of you to comment on. What we produce, we tend to evaluate it in terms of the way we produced it, if I'm following your argument. So the same methods, the same techniques that we use to generate a proposal, we tend to use something those or something very similar to say this was worthwhile and it's a good thing and it performs in this way. On the other hand, if I not putting words into Theo's mouth, but if I take something he said, I might really have a drive to continue to experiment with the work and not care at all what other people say about it, because I'm going to be the foremost critic. I'm going to be the one that wants to continue and develop it. So somewhere in between these two, and maybe we oscillate between them, but if we could address some part of that, and if I could start with Theo.
I thought you spoke for me, Mike.
I always give the hot potato to Theo.
Yeah, I'll try not to do a mic drop kind of thing. My feeling around some of these things is not just to pick up on first Mike's comment. I'm not sure that we're looking for solutions, because I think we identify that we're not really, in ourselves, we're not capable of finding a solution to some of the issues and the magnitude that are being explored, but I think we definitely need to see the role that architects have as active participants, to really have a seat at the table, to be part of the conversation, and honestly to leverage, I think, a certain kind of goodwill that architects have in terms of trying to ask, what does today actually mean in the context of the environment and all of these things that we're talking about. Second of all, I can just sort of declare that I don't really believe in method. If I can make a statement of purpose, the DRL is against method. And that's why experimentation doesn't have a value system that is shared and finite. It's evolving and debated and discursively interrogated and torn apart. It's more Samuel Beckett. If we're living in a kind of history of failures, fail better, fail again. Mostly because I don't really believe in failure. But I think that that's probably where we set up the experiment and use the lab as an environment to explore ideas and try to get closer to those kind of more informed questions. So.
Thank you. I'm very confident Descartes would have approved of those statements.
So maybe I pick up on the participatory part of the question. I think there are kind of several aspects to that. First of all, I think the studio itself in MTech is quite participatory, because as I said also in the presentation, it's kind of like an atelier. So, we learn from our students, obviously they hopefully learn from us, but there's kind of this collaborative environment, there's this constant dialogue. So I think that's an important part of the participation. Then of course, no need to say, the dissertations themselves are are done in teams, so there's that participatory aspect as well. So, there is, again, this collaborative effort into creating a research output. But I also want to emphasize, the fact that the proposals themselves should enable the participatory nature when we think about the actual users of those proposals in the future. And I think that that's very important because, the kind of cultural and social aspect of the methods that we're evolving are actually very important, and that's evolving very fast. We need to understand the cultural and social context of where we're operating, understand the people's needs without imposing anything on them. And I think we need to question what it means to be participatory in different environments around the world. And I think research methods is an essential part of evolving that understanding.
I think something that two programs would share is that architecture isn't about the creation of a finished product that someone else is going to live in or work in, so much as enabling other people to make things and inhabit things and produce new things. So if I can ask for the final response from Kate and your team.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the fact that a piece of research is never finished, and we like to think of Hook Park as a giant laboratory table, a continuous laboratory. And once those things are built, they are in a continuous mode of testing, short-term, long-term, and they're in a mode of being kind of given over to other people. And that is part of the testing, being handed on to, these guys will hand them on to another generation of students. They will go through a process of evaluating and living in them, test through occupation. But I think that, the way we work is probably the most important part, rather than what we're producing, if that makes sense. The kind of, the collective, the way that as an educational model is actually very important. I mean, we feel for the way that as architects we will address future problems, future issues. It's not about what the problem is that we're solving, it's about how we're going about it. And that multidisciplinarity, that collectiveness, not architects going out and trying to colonize other disciplines, but actively bringing expertise in to architecture to try and have a holistic understanding of where our discipline meets other expertise, and expanding the design brief, the scope of the problem that we're being inventive about, not by expanding our territory, but by through generosity, by inviting people into that territory. I think that is the way is more important than perhaps the things we build.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending today. We have another session tomorrow, so please come. It will be around about this time. We'll start again and try and keep them to an hour. Bring coffee and sandwiches, bring your friends, and we'll see three very different approaches tomorrow. Thank you.